Hello, everyone. Welcome to January, Silver Birch. And for the Woodland Walk today, we are incredibly lucky to have Alnoor Ladha with us, who is someone that I met at a really amazing local futures conference and have since listened to so many podcasts with Alnoor and his co-author, Lynn Murphy, speaking about their incredible book, which I'm going to hold up. It is just wonderful, and we're going to be talking lots more about it. It's Post Capitalist Philanthropy, Healing Wealth in the Time of Collapse. And we'll talk about this book and many other things, but we will first come back to the Silver Birch and think about why we've invited Alnoor for this month's theme. So we'll talk a little bit about the Silver Birch, and then I'll ask Alnoor to introduce himself and also his amazing book after the introduction. So Silver Birch tree is our tree for letting go. It's a tree for letting go of the old stories. And the metaphor we use with the silver birch is how the silver birch bark peels away. It's constantly exfoliating itself, all the old layers, all the old stories, because silver birch bark looks like paper. So the parchment of a story, and it exfoliates off and exfoliates off, and all the old stories fall away, revealing this kind of clean slate, this tabula rasa every moment. But the other thing about the silver birch is that when the silver birch has a gash or an injury in the tree, when there is a wound, something falls against it, or it's in a storm, these mushrooms called birch polypores will attach themselves to the site of the wounding, and the mushrooms will compost away that dead wood, and they will also activate the tree's immune system. So when I was reading this beautiful book, which we'll go into more detail about, this beautiful, incredible, world-changing, radical shifting of your whole worldview book, this idea about the birch polypore having this job of composting away the dead wood and activating the immune system. And I'm going to ask Alnoor, I'm going to ask you to talk about this in a bit more detail, but what this book really talks about, to give a kind of very simple, perhaps too simplistic kind of summary, is composting away capitalist modernity, which philanthropy is a part of holding up. It continues this system of power over. And composting that away and activating our humanity's natural immune system, which is into being part of this web of life. So Alnoor, could you talk more, because that's such a simplification, could you talk more about what you see as being composted away in this time and what you see as being activated in this time, and in so doing introduce yourself, your work, your lineage, what you believe in, how you live, your thoughts about psychedelics, your thoughts about nature, anything you would like to bring in to this question of composting and activating. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the beautiful introduction. Yeah, it's a big question. Compost and the revivification of life, revivification of life, that's happening simultaneously. So the book is about philanthropy, ostensibly, but it's not really about philanthropy, as you know from reading it. It's philanthropy is just one lens into the meta crisis. I think we're all familiar with the meta crisis, probably in this group of humans, which is the idea that there isn't a climate crisis, an economic crisis, and a spiritual crisis, an ecological crisis, and species extinction. And all of these things are interconnected with the operating system of late stage capitalism. Uh, the brand of capitalism that we now have and have had since the late 1970s is called neoliberalism. Itself is morphing and becoming other things. For example, the former Greek finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, talks about neoliberalism morphing into technological feudalism, where companies like Facebook and Google and ChatGPT and others kind of own these ecospheres within the digital world, which is becoming more and more of our day-to-day life. But the upshot is that there is an ideology And most of us are ideologically illiterate because that's just the way that, in the dominant culture, if you are ideologically aware or sensitive of power and structure and systems, um, there's derogatory terms for that, right? You're an ideologue, you're overly political, what have you. And what happens is by us not having awareness of the political economic operating system that is really like the oxygen we breathe, it's mediating every aspect of our lives, we end up by ignoring that and not bringing that to the center of our discourse and discussions, we end up ratifying the existing system. And this existing system of neoliberalism is more than just a political economy. It's really a theology. It's a religion. And within the religion of neoliberalism, there's this belief that human beings are inherently selfish, that competition is required, that hierarchy is required, that the individual is the primary unit of power, the locus of decision making, um, that money is the arbiter of virtue and goodness. So if you have money, you're somehow worthy and smart, as opposed to, let's say, greedy and lucky, right? And if you don't have money, you're somehow a moral failing without any historical understanding, right? Of how, from whence this money came, right? Which has been this, 500-year head start Western Europeans have had through colonialism, imperialism, genocide, enslavement, pillage of the land, expropriation, all of that. And so it's like pull yourself up by the bootstraps. And I think most importantly, this aspect of neoliberalism that is the kind of most prevalent, but also the most invisible, is what we call the unholy trinity of separation, materialism, and rationalism, right? That human beings are somehow separate from the rest of the living world. We are on top of the evolutionary ladder, that hierarchy, as opposed to, let's say, being the youngest, most immature species. The materialism is that we can reduce the entire world to its material constituents, to its parts, right? The entire world can be reduced to the atom to the neutron, the proton, the electron, and now with quantum physics, the quanta or the photon or the quasar or what have you. And so science is moving towards this grand unifying theory of everything, which is, such a hubristic, arrogant, anthropocentric lens on the world. And then the rationalism part is not only can we understand the world and break it down and dominate it for our needs and pleasure, but we are entitled to do so. And so there's deep entitlement at the core of this. And I think all of these aspects of neoliberalism in very important ways are being composted, but simultaneously they're also very resilient, right? These ideas take mimetic form. So we use the word meme in pop culture to talk about, internet memes like lolcats or whatever. But meme comes from the study of memetics, which is the biography of ideas, how ideas move through populations and culture. It was coined by Richard Dawkins in the 1970s in his book, The Selfish Gene. And a meme is a base unit of an idea. So the cultural base unit. And these memes are communicable like diseases. And let's take a meme, for example, like the invisible hand, right? Which is a very pervasive, sticky meme. It's taught in every economics textbook and most business schools. We hear it in the media all the time. Our political economies are organized around it. This idea that if we give rich people and corporations tax breaks because they're job creators, somehow everyone is going to benefit, right? This invisible hand is like a market god, and it'll raise all boats. And we've had now almost 60 years plus of neoliberalism. And we know that that's not at all the case, that actually inequality increases, fascism increases, corporate power increases, there's a hijack of democracy through money in politics, more exploitation happens, destruction of the ecology happens. And yet, the idea itself is so powerful that every new thing we start creating is based on some kind of market mechanism. right? We've done that to the internet, which had this potential to be a digital commons, has now turned into a digital marketplace governed by this invisible hand. And so whether we identify as anti-capitalists or socialists or communists or communalists or post-capitalists or what have you, there's an invisible hand that lives within all of us because these memes take up real estate in our bodies. And so you'll see in the book, a lot of the focus is around the idea of embodied cognition, which is we need to understand how the system works, not just at an intellectual level, but really at a somatic level, and to know where it lives within us so we could disrupt the patterns and break the habituation that leads to our complicity in the system. So just to answer your question, and we can open it up a bit more. For sure, there's aspects of it composting. It's happening at an individual level, a community level, much more slowly at the level of global culture, if such a thing exists. And at the same time, we're seeing the sprouts of these new alternatives. And I'd say what unifies what we would call like post-capitalist alternatives is not, we don't mean post as in the thing that comes after capitalism, as if there's going to be one new monolithic system that replaces the existing system. But it's more a nod to the plethora of ideas that will come based on values that are informed by capitalism. So there's no dash between post and capitalism. It's sort of like the way academics talk about postmodernity, informed by. So you have to know the water in which you swim, this kind of ideological architecture, and then you have to build outside of that system through a different set of values. So what are the values of the existing system? Well, we just look around us, right? It's short-termism, greed, extraction, expropriation, violence, perpetual war, patriarchy, white supremacy, and this deep sense of entitlement, and I would say entitlement, control, and certainty that comes from the Occidental mindset. And so the alternative to that would be based on values of generosity, of altruism, of reciprocity, of cooperation, of interbeing, of solidarity with all of life. And there's been experiments like that that have, we look at certain indigenous communities and cultures that have always based their societal organizing around these principles. So they're inherently post-capitalist. And they were around before capitalism even existed. And then we look at projects like the Zapatistas in Mexico, who have taken over a huge swath of Chiapas, the breadbasket of Mexico, and built their own alternative community, their own currencies, their own education system, their own roads. We're seeing and they're about a 1.5 million person community. So it's not a small experiment. And we see it in places like Rojava in the Middle East, between Syria, Iraq, and Turkey, that's created a 5 million person female-led ecological society. The Kurdish national home now, the autonomous region of Rojava. And
Wow.
so they're happening. They're not happening at the scale and level of replication we need to be, in a commensurate response to the current meta crisis, but they're happening. And they're happening in all, smaller projects, alternative communities, alternative currency projects, the rights of nature, the land back movement. There's a plethora of activity happening. And of course, the media and the dominant culture are never going to be able to reflect that back to us because that's not their role, right? The role of the media is to be the handmaiden of the dominant culture. And so what the media is going to do is make it seem like these are all kind of one-off alternatives, or these resistances are not connected, that they're disparate. But whether it's a land rights struggle in India, or a tax justice struggle in Kenya, or stopping a pipeline in Turtle Island, they're all reflections of the same impulse, which is this system is not working for the majority of the world, and we, as a kind of a world of alternatives, are being birthed and nurtured and curated and amplified. And so both are happening simultaneously, and it's simultaneously also not enough. That's just this place of kind of non-dualist acceptance, uh, just from looking at what's happening in the world. Um, but possibility exists, and the more collapse and the intensity of collapse increases, the more these alternatives are going to become increasingly viable.
Yes. Oh, thank you. That's a beautiful, yeah, beautiful description. Um, and whilst I was reading this book, because I suppose the first, I guess, kind of two parts of it is really understanding what's being composted away and how it needs to. And even though I feel like I'm kind of immersed in that, reading about that and listening to podcasts about that and talking to people about that, I still the language and the metaphor and just the way your book lays it out, that even philanthropy, as you say, it's not, philanthropy is in a way just one of the symptoms, but there's something that I myself took for granted, like philanthropy is kind of good. It's the good bit of, that realizing that wholesale, like even the bit of it that I thought was kind of okay, like how deep rooted the kind of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of, like, as you talk about the kind of our way of understanding the world, our ontology being there being something that needs to be made whole in that understanding about the living web, that we do not control nature, or that we are not superior to other parts of the web, but that there's this animacy and living, breathing world. And so how long we've been living in this kind of very misguided way. Reading it was really like, I mean, it was kind of exciting, but also deep. Like, I cried many tears in the first like two sections of the book. It was beautiful to have those lovely pictures that you have and paintings, because like gold lettering. It was like it's a very beautiful book, which I really needed because it helped me process it, as you say, in an embodied somatic way. You have exercises through to help you integrate it in an embodied somatic way, and the art really helped with that. But even so, it was a lot to take, and there were a lot of tears. And one of the things that gave me hope, apart from the latter part of the book, was also knowing, which I know separately, I don't think you talk about it in the book, but I knew from listening to podcasts, that the way you are living is you are, I guess, trying to live in this other way. So that is more in line with this idea of a reciprocal web, rather than this kind of dominating, the kind of modern world that we live in the West. Could you tell us a little bit about it, and the just a summary, and like you talked about values, the value system of how you live where you live?
Yeah, no, I'm always a bit hesitant to talk about our land project, or at least to position in a way that we have like any answers or we've got it right or something like that, right? Because that's not at all the case. But we live in an experiment. We moved to rural Costa Rica about 8 years ago in the Northwest, in the jungle. Um, about 20 of us friends came together, bought a kind of old rundown farm and put it into a trust so nobody owns the land. We call it a post-capitalist experiment. Uh, Not that we are outside of the capitalist system, right? Because of course, whether you live in an alternative community or not, like my clothes are most likely made in sweatshops. Um, our farm truck uses fossil fuels, right? We're integrated into the global supply chain, but as much as we can, um, we're kind of aware, let's say, or attempt to be as aware as one can be of the consequences of the dominant way of living and the globalized culture, and then try to build outside of that. So one aspect of that is non-speculation on land. So no one can benefit from the increase in land value and then try to sell land um, for private profit. Um, that's one big key component. Another is we run it as a not-for-profit cooperative. So a portion of the surplus gets shared among everyone, no distinction between labor and capital. So whether you're one of the 20 partners who put in the initial funds, or you're a local Costa Rican working full-time on the farm or in the healing center, you're a partner. Because what matters is the work we're doing together, not the fact that some of us were luckier in this global casino in the lottery system of neoliberalism. That wealth is not an entitlement, uh, right? That it's an entrustment that requires bringing in a broader circle of allies, human and more than human. So that's the second aspect is cooperative ownership. The third is food sovereignty. So it's an 88-acre farm. We're growing about 50% of our own food now. We're trying to get to 100% within the next 5 years. Um, and so many of us were urban, and we have to, relearn the skills of doing syntropic farming, having chickens, all of the stuff that comes with that. Um, the fourth is that we put healing at the center. Um, we know that there's no kind of there's no purity, right? There's no like evolved being in a system that requires the destruction of all of life all of the time. And so we have to put grief and ritual and ceremony and kind of trauma-informed lens into the healing work and the practices we do as a community. So that's a big aspect. And then the fifth is mutual aid, that 5% of the top line revenue of the center, whether we make money or lose money in any given year, goes to a mutual aid network for this bioregion that we've helped co-create with the local community. Yeah, so that's kind of, it's not we are doing this because we think this is the most effective model and this is what everyone should do. It's more like we want to live our values. And most of us are activists and artists and healers and want to live in a community that supports that type of thinking and being. And it allows us to do the work we're doing in the world with at least some integrity and consistency. We're all implicated in the system, right? There is no being outside of it, and yet there are ways to live that are just more commensurate with our values, and that's the attempt we're trying to do here.
Beautiful. And I'd love to ask you maybe some other time. I'd be so interested to know about your key learnings over the years of doing that, because it's on my mind so much as well. Like actual, ASA, we have our online global community, and we're starting to think more about how we can form bonds with our local communities. So bring what we learn as a community online globally in our kind of online hub to our local communities and start doing that kind of thing. But I'm thinking beyond that as well, and of living, like thinking forward to like 10 years time and thinking about communal living and how to, many of the things you're saying, yes, that's my wish list. So I would love to one day, maybe if it's something that you're kind of collective are happy with, is to ask, what are the things that you would say to other people that want to form these kind of communities? Like, do you have like 5 top tips of like things that you wish you'd known before you started? Because I bet you've learned so much on your journey.
Yeah, and you're constantly learning. I think the thing to say is like to just do it, and you learn as you go. And of course, doing it with people who are aligned values wise, like that's been central to us, is that we're very explicitly political. Um, and we think that's super important to say up front so you attract the right type of people, right? And then also the shared work we do is work we're all interested in. All the programming that happens at Tierra Valiente, the center, we call it the Center for Applied Cultural Transition, is in these 3 theme areas of gnosis, polis, and eros. So gnosis is, direct wisdom, access to knowledge. So this is the plant medicine work we do, psychedelic work, dieta work. But it's also the silent retreats and the vipassanas and the tantra work and um, uh, having, indigenous elders come and do their various teachings. And the polis is rethinking the political economy. So we do a lot of political gatherings here. We actually run a fellowship uh, that links polis and gnosis called the Reworlding Fellowship, which I think we've talked about before, which is 30 political leaders coming to do medicine on the land and having 3 months of preparation and 3 months of integration and bringing ontology, like the way we see the world, into that. And then the eros is not that we're an open love community, but we believe like your relationship is not private, it affects the field. And so in communal space, talking about relationality and also thinking of eros as our kinship with the more than human world. That Eros is not just an anthropocentric interaction, that it's happening with the broader world. And so, how do we bring that into dialogue and discussion? And so we do like biomimicry workshops here, and we think a lot about this intersection of like Eros and Gaia, and how we can, or Eros and Bios, and how we can be more deeply available to the living world and be in dialogue with her.
Beautiful. How can are these workshops, are they available, open to the public? How can people find out more? Yeah, how?
Yeah, so some of them are, most of them are actually. You could just go to braveearth.com under experiences, and there's a whole list of what's coming up for the year.
Hmm. Thank you, Alnoor. I think people in our people in our community will, yeah, and actually, I am also going to be fascinated to look into those and see what you're doing there. And we don't have very much long left, but I guess, well, there were a couple of other things that I wanted to, ideas of yours that we've kind of touched on, I guess, but I think just the language of them feels so powerful to maybe just ask you about very briefly. So one of these ideas is that you talk about going from a trauma culture to an initiation culture, and that I talk about memes. That like sentence just kind of emblazoned itself on my field of vision, and as I have, from reading the book, just one of the experiences of reading it is that it just made everything so clear. It felt like so many pennies kind of dropped, and then I would glance up from my book at whatever I was doing and look at it in a way with kind of new eyes, like, oh yes, this is the trauma culture. And then I was like, yes, and we can move into an initiation culture. And it just that idea felt so reassuring. Can you say a few things more about that?
Yeah, so this comes from the work of Francis Weller, whose books I highly recommend. He wrote a series of essays during COVID called "In the Absence of the Ordinary," which is very beautiful. Um, and then he wrote a book on grief called "The Wild Edges of Sorrow," which is also very beautiful. I believe he's working on a new book now. Um, and it's in some ways a very simple insight, right? He says that trauma and initiation go through the same three cycles, right? There's uh, a kind of severance from the world in order to have this intense experience. There is a realization that you will never be able to go back into the world, like a threshold marking. And then there is the integration back into the world, whether that's extremely difficult as it is in trauma culture. And so this kind of severance threshold integration, uh, these are like he calls them in the dominant culture uncontained encounters with death, and in initiation cultures it's contained encounters with death. There's an aspect of you dying. That there's this kind of intensity of threshold, but cultures kind of worthy of the word culture know how to hold you, right? That you're born into these intact cultures, wisdom cultures, indigenous cultures, mystical traditions, spiritual communities that orient you to the context and to the moment we're in. And then that at some moment, you'll be pulled out of your bread. I was thinking of and he talks a lot about the Dogon because he had worked with Malidoma Somé, for example. So the Dogon of West Africa, their children, I believe it's males at like kind of prepubescent, pubescent age, 13, 14, are pulled out of their bed one day and buried in the earth for 3 days, their head above the soil. And the community has a vigil for them, is lighting a fire. He may not be able to see them, but the child knows that they're kind of, yonder somewhere there holding space. And when they come out of this experience, their old ego self, their child self dies, and they are in service to something greater than themselves. They've touched the edge of death, so they know the value of life. And we don't have that, right? We're born into this kind of, Hakeem Bey would call it the work, consume, die paradigm. That our role is to get the best education we can, to memorize the most crap, to get a vocation that will allow us to acquire lots of stuff so we could be in this kind of materialistic pyramid, slightly higher than the person below us, right? And what it does is just trauma on trauma on trauma, because there's no contextualization of how we got into this place in the first place. There's no elders, there's no ceremony, there's no ritual. And that part of our role in this moment is to bring back that context, to bring back that community, to say, this is where we are in this moment in time, which is why I think context setting is so important, right? For example, scientists call this moment the Anthropocene, right? The era where anthropos, the human, has affected every aspect of our biosphere. For example, the Iroquois prophecy, this is the time of the seventh fire, where we decide between, oblivion and catastrophe on one side, or some kind of emergence that we don't know what will come of it, but it's this active choice moment. The Hopi have a similar prophecy with the time of the sixth sun. The Buddhists call this the time of the great degeneration. The alchemical tradition calls this the time of the underworld. The Vedic traditions, where Hinduism and Buddhism come from, talks about the Kali Yuga, right? The dark ages. The time is cyclical. And what Vedic astrologers will say is like, we're in the midst of the Kali Yuga. Some will argue that we're almost out of it. Some will say we're thousands of years away from ending it. But to just acknowledge that we are in this very dark period in human history, to not be seduced by the techno-utopian kind of neo-optimist progress agenda, right? Progress is an arrow and it's going ever up and to the right. And, this is the Bill Gates, Steven Pinker worldview. Like, we have a microwave in every house, so the world must therefore be getting better. GDP is increasing. And it's like, yeah, and 200 species a day are going extinct, 1,000 times the baseline rate. We're in the midst of the great extinction as a direct result of our political economy, of capitalism, of the comforts that many of us in the West enjoy. Our addiction to Amazon.com is directly related to the destruction of this planet. And so what are you measuring, and how do you measure the destruction of old growth forests, or indigenous communities, or languages, or species that will never come back? And so just by orienting, there's a line from the Vedas that says, if you don't know you're in the Kali Yuga, you're of no use to the Kali Yuga. If you don't know you're in the Anthropocene, you're of no use to the Anthropocene. You have to orient around the moment and the context you're in order to say, okay, I'm going to have to create my own initiation in this culture. I'm going to have to draw the line and say, this culture that I've been born into and that I've benefited from no longer serves the planet, and I no longer identify with it. And when we're not identified with the culture, we're much more likely to A, not apologize for the culture, B, not try to convert other people into the culture through whatever it is, financial inclusion, so-called development, social entrepreneurship, what have you, and start actively creating, lived alternatives to it. But C, and most importantly, we ourselves start becoming available to the dialogue of an animate earth that is asking something else from us. But if we're satisfied and happy with the way things are going, despite its effect on 98% of humanity and the rest of the living planet, then we actually cut ourselves off from the availability of different types of intelligences.
Beautiful. Thanks. So beautifully explained, and kind of ties us in a little bit to the theme that we'll be looking at in our next month's tree, which, so in our month of February, we look at love and grief being two sides of the same coin. We look at the rowan tree and about how our grief teaches us what we care for and what we stand for. So as you were saying then, to really be of use for this time, we have to acknowledge first the deep heartbreak, and to be able to start creating these lived alternatives, it's acknowledging first how very, very, I can't even think of a word for like the destructiveness of the way we are living now. So from that heartbreak, from that grief comes great joy, because I think, I don't know whether you would agree with this, Alnoor, but I feel like so many of us have been living in this kind of comfortable misery for so long that we've been kind of comfortable and kind of satiated and kind of numbed, but really there's been a deep, deep longing and a deep kind of chasm. Maybe it's a spiritual chasm, but just this sense, this kind of like seventh sense or whatever, or like a kind of like embodied feeling that there's something very, very wrong with the way we're living, just underneath all the comforts and all the Amazon and everything being delicious and easy. Well, easy, but but like underneath it, this deep, deep, dark feeling of pain. And that when we start to acknowledge that and come together to say, okay, well, we're not going to be as comfortable, but we're going to have the incredible comfort and joy of not having that chasm anymore, because we know what we're doing and we are working towards the alternative. And it's like, I think it was Bob Marley that said something like, rich people are so poor because all they have is money, or something like that. I don't know if I've said that quote, but there's something about the deep impoverishment of luxury, of like material luxury, and the incredible lux, like genuine spiritual luxury of actually having a purpose and finding others with the same purpose and working towards it, and like knowing that you are finally able to do something that is being of use to the times that we're in. So I think that we are, for all the challenges that lie ahead, we're going to have a time of great grief, but also great love, and perhaps be much happier in some ways than we've been before.
Yeah, completely. And Francis Weller again he talks about primary needs versus secondary needs, right? And the primary needs are, care, belonging, relationality, being connected to something bigger than you, spiritual purpose. And the secondary needs are status, money, wealth, acknowledgement, and we've created a culture where everyone is vying for secondary needs, but is impoverished of the primary needs. And so by inverting that, we start to create these, more embodied post-capitalist cultures. One of his lines on secondary needs is, "You can never have too much of a thing you don't need."
Mm.
You can never have too much of a thing that you don't need. And that's where the acquisition and the greed and the perpetual consumption and the hungry ghost aspect of late stage capitalism comes in.
Well, Alnoor, it's been such a pleasure talking with you. I'm incredibly grateful.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you.
Oh,
Yeah,
thank
thank
you.
you for your time. Yeah,
We will put links to all of these podcasts and your book, and in the platform. And we hope you'll come back and talk to us again in the future at some point.
I'd love that anytime.
Oh, thank you so much, Alnoor.
Thanks so much, Russ. We'll see you soon.